Thank you, Amber. I'm glad to be here representing the National Pork Board. And I'm going to give a brief introduction to what Carol will share with all of you as far as the research and insights that went into her work. The National Pork Board is proud to work with Heart+Mind strategies to dig deeper into the myths. And when you look at the spectrum of pork production myths, that Myth Busting 1.0 campaign that Amber mentioned really addresses the first two sections of the spectrum. And then the work that Carol is going to give us an overview on dug into that middle section of the spectrum. So I'm excited to hear more about Carol's research, and for all of you too, there will be time for questions at the end. So make sure if you have questions or are wondering about how, as a state, Minnesota can utilize this research and information to communicate about pork production to our audiences, be sure to ask those at the end. So, Carol, I'm excited to welcome you to the stage. We look forward to hearing more about the research and insights that went into the consumer survey.
Thank you, Caitlin. Good to be here. If you were part of the earlier meeting today on sustainability, you heard terms like evidence-based. And so as we look through today, the lens of sustainability and specifically a deeper focus on animal well-being, we're thinking about evidence from the eyes of the consumer. And so what does the consumer hold truth when they think about these issues with respect to their choices on meat consumption and specifically on pork? And know that consumers' opinions are based on a variety of things, from what they read, what they hear, what they see, what they experience. Some of those things might be accurate, some might not be accurate. But today we're going to show you what is that representative view of that consumer's lens, specifically on animal well-being. So we'll share the insights from the research this afternoon. The overall objective was very much focused on understanding perceptions and behaviors of consumers with respect to animal well-being for animals raised specifically for food. This was a survey sponsored from the National Pork Board with a very sizable sample. So over 2,000 adults across the country, and then 1,000 per each of the states, the 8 states listed there. And the decision was made to look specifically at those states as they were deemed as potentially higher risk states for legislative actions, perhaps pressures and opposition against the pork industry with respect to animal well-being. So important to look through the lens not just at a national level, but also through the people that live in those specific states. Let me start with just a bit of context as well, because while sustainability and animal well-being are very important, those are not always the most important items when people are thinking about when they're identifying their meat to choose, right? So when we think about those most important items, and this is a slide from the National Pork Board's at-home tracker, tracking how important are all of the things, all of those drivers of choice for consumers. Of course, you're going to see things like taste. Taste is at the top, and it's an equity for pork, clearly an equity for pork. Nutrition, ease, I can feel good about eating it, it's good for my family. And you look at a lot of the good for the planet drivers, and in the big picture, when you step back, you could say, those are less important than the other things. So keep that in context. They're important to people, to a smaller percentage of people, but they are important overall. When we drill deeper and look at the issues that are important to consumers with respect to pork, top one is safety, of course, the health and safety of the food itself. It's a safe product to consume for myself and for my family. Care of animals is second most important. Many, many issues, and you heard about a lot of these in the sustainability discussion this morning, from wastewater to mitigating odors to permitting, many issues that are very important, but look at care of animals very close to the actual safety of the pork itself and safety of the food supply. Yep. Flexitarian is a type of a consumer we look at who's eating less meat, right? So they're making choices in their diet and reducing meat consumption. They're not, all the way to a vegetarian or a vegan, but in audience it's reduced. What are people talking about? So in some of the research where they're tracking commentary and social media and conversations, animal well-being is dominating those types of conversations. So raising animal rights, two of the categories that are higher in terms of the mentions on what people are talking about, and that sentiment tends to be negative. So we see some negative buzz trend here as well, in terms of that negative buzz talking about health concerns. Certainly, as Caitlin mentioned with the Mythbusters, Mythbusters is trying to correct those false narratives that may exist about the pork industry and pork meat. And then the view that pigs are raised in unsanitary conditions, also negative buzz based on inaccurate information. So the Animal Wellbeing Survey itself, I'm going to talk about the national results in total. I may point out where some of those states were different from the national, and you can see where maybe some risk was higher. But this first question is really trying to get at, do people even think about this? Do they think about the well-being of animals being raised for food? And this is all animals. So in this question, it's not just hogs, but it's all animals being raised for food. Do I think about it? About half of the country thinks about it, either sometimes or a lot. Some on the right, you can see just over a quarter. I never really think about that at all. Not an issue for me, not even on my radar. But in some of the states, California, Massachusetts, Washington, have a higher index of people thinking about it. And then, okay, you're thinking about it. Do you see it as a problem or not? Similarly, we see about half that indicate it as a problem. 49% at the national level, again, over-indexing for those in California, Washington, Oregon, and Massachusetts. 1 in 6 really don't think about that, don't view it as a problem. I found this to be one of the most interesting pieces of insight that came from this work. When the Pork Board went into this work, Prop 12, a lot of media in the press around Prop 12, I think the hypothesis was that if you begin to dissect the animal well-being issues that people are worried about or think is a problem, housing is going to be number one. That was the hypothesis going into this work. So we looked at animal health, defined as animals that are free from pain, injury, and disease, animal nutrition, free from hunger, thirst, and disease, animal housing, and then animal behavior. And we looked at, well, what's most important to you when you think about animals being raised for food? Animal health and nutrition, the top two, and the top two by far. Animal housing, important, but you can see there 43% of the mentions versus 69% on animal health, free from pain, injury, and disease. Curious, just surprising to you, or that's what you might have expected to hear from consumers, right? So with all the talk about housing, and this was taken late last year, we would have expected to see that a little bit higher. So still important, but people want to hear about what are producers doing with respect to health and nutrition. That, in a very proactive fashion, can help offset concerns that they might have on housing and other issues. When we compare the pig farming practices with other livestock farming and animal well-being, about a third say, you're just the same as others. Over a quarter, 28%, you're worse than others. Again, we've got a quarter of the population that just doesn't pay attention to that. Texas and California, we saw we're more likely to believe that pig farming is worse than others. Massachusetts and Oregon really don't know. California was least likely to say they don't know, probably due to more press specifically in California. Nationally, I found this quite helpful to understand as well. Nationally, more people think that there's reasonable standards today than think that there's not been enough done. And a lot don't know. So when it comes to their view of standards that are placed and mandates placed on the industry, just 19% felt it's not been done, not enough. 7% thought we've gone too far. A third say reasonable standards. And again, almost 4 in 10 don't really know. Now, the connection here is the more trust in farmers, the more likely people say that standards are fine as is. So that pressure, right? As people become more aware of the standards, the we care principles, the standards and practices put in place on farms, that improves their trust in farmers, which reduces pressure on interest in higher standards. We dug into a little bit about, well, what concerns might you have if there were more standards or mandates placed on the industry? Number one, and certainly think about the context of the country right now, there's a lot of concern about inflation and the cost of food, the cost of meat. That's our number one concern. Higher standards are going to increase the cost of food. That's a barrier for them. 25% said it's really not going to make a significant difference on the actual animal well-being. It's not going to connect to that. Similarly, negative impact on the livelihood of farmers. Just over 1 in 5, a negative impact on food security and reduced ability to produce food sustainably. So there's a recognition of challenges with increased mandates and standards. Trust in the pig farmers remains positive. And certainly, as I mentioned, there's more trust among those who are aware of the industry programs and of the we care principles. But nationally, 63% of the country trusts farmers today, and that's even higher among those that are aware of we care and PQA Plus and all the standards that are put in place. One of the things that we did with this piece of work is try to dig in and understand, well, who are the people that care more about the animal care issues? How do we identify who they are? What are those things that are most important to them? And we identified 3 specific groups. People who are concerned and they vote. People who are concerned and they influence others on their opinion of the industry, and then just looking overall at our meat reducers. So this first group, the concerned public influentials, these are people who think about the well-being of animals being raised for food, either sometimes or a lot, and they view the well-being of animals raised for food as a problem today, and they regularly engage in activities in their communities. They might hold office in local groups. They might write to the editor. They might advocate in social media for specific causes, but they're active influentials in the communities in which they live. That's 23% of the public. That's a lot of people. who are concerned about these issues and speaking out about those issues to others. Over-indexed in Massachusetts, Oregon, and the state of Washington versus the national average, lower in the state of Tennessee. The other group was the nationally concerned voters. Again, they're thinking about it a lot. They think it's a problem, and they vote locally. And by that I mean we kind of put a higher bar on vote locally. It wasn't just the people that come out for the presidential election every 4 years, but you're voting on local ballot issues, and that's 15% of the public. Still a smaller percent, but you count that out to how many people in the public it is, it's a large group. And then our meat reducers, 28% nationally are reducing meat consumption, and you translate that to population, that's 23 million alone in California, Florida, and Texas. Large chunk. So we took a look at, okay, what do those circles look like? Is there some overlap? Are some of these the same people? So you've got a little bit of that. Most of your concerned voters are also concerned influentials. So we have some overlap. But what it also says is, if you look at these groups across the public at large, 45% of the public falls into one of those three circles. 55% does not. So if you step back and say, okay, 45% of the public are either concerned voters, concerned influencers, or meat reducers, that's a large part of the population that you have an opportunity to further educate and communicate with and tell your story in a positive and proactive way. We also profiled those folks in terms of what are some of the demographic characteristics that might be common with them, so you can kind of get a sense overall. They lean more female than male. Our concerned public influentials are younger, more diverse, more educated, more urban, more progressive and democratic as well. This is helpful, and the way you can use something like this is knowing that when you're speaking with particular demographics in your communities and your different audiences that you're talking with, understanding who might be more likely to be part of a group that is more concerned, so that you can understand how best to communicate with them and the things that are important to them. We know that the messages, when you're out and talking with the community, the messages that highlight your proactive efforts on We Care and your principles and your standards make a difference and help to improve the image of pork overall, leading to less pressure on increased standards. But we do that in a way that aligns with what people care about, right? So when we think about, what pork brings to people and that sense of joy, as I showed on one of those first slides, taste, nutrition, the experience with my family, these are all great aspects of consuming pork. I feel like I'm making good choices as a parent when I'm feeding my children such a high protein meat. That ladder over there on the far side in green, it gets to helping people feel good about their choices. The more they know about the good care of the animal, the more they're going to feel good. They're going to feel less guilt about eating pork. They'll feel good about their choices. It enhances that ease and peace of mind when they're making those choices. And just a few, statements that consumers have said, what they want to hear about pork sustainability, that pigs are raised under the optimal environmental conditions and checked daily for health. Modern pig practices help protect the health of pigs. The PQA Plus program site assessments and auditing certify those that are responsible for pig care have been trained. A sense that you're committed to raising pork in safe, humane, and sustainable ways. These are messages and facts that help improve the image of pork. So just a few closing thoughts, in particular, in dealing with communications and telling your story on animal care. Again, focus on those things that were more important. They had higher expectation on the animal health, animal nutrition versus housing, right? Housing's still important, but leading that narrative on the health and nutrition messaging kind of taps into that sense of comfort, care, safety. I'm making a good choice for my family. Increased awareness of industry initiatives and programs improves that trust in you and all of you and farmers. And then messaging that aligns with consumers' values are most likely to be relatable and relevant to them in terms of delivering on that joy that they're seeking in consuming pork with their families. With that, we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Carol.
Yep.
Any questions from the audience?
Any surprises?
Have a well-versed crowd here. All right, we got one back here. Too many tables.
So you were asking us whether we saw any surprises. Were you surprised at all with something? I was not surprised at all. Maybe there was some, in the demographics, some of the younger people, maybe a little bit of that. But I always question, are they reading what they're supposed to be reading, right? Are they listening the story from one of their producers here in the room? Are they, were you surprised at all with any of these results?
My biggest surprise is I expected that housing was going to be kind of their number one hot issue in terms of when they think about the animal well-being, that housing would be even more important than when we saw it here. That was probably my number one surprise. The demographics were consistent with the sustainability work that we've been doing with MPD over the past few years in terms of those, your urban, your younger generations, your higher educated, asking more questions, kind of looking behind the curtain to see who's actually making the products that they consume, what are their practices. They're asking more questions, so that very confirmatory. Yep.
Just kind of a follow-up to that question. Is it the reason why housing becomes number one versus health and nutrition they're concerned about? Is it because they have confidence in the health and nutrition that's taking place, and so therefore it's important, but I'm not worried about it because it's being taken care of, so I'm going to look at housing because it's something that I can see? Is there any kind of perspective you can give to that, or it's probably too in the weeds?
No, not too in the weeds. But the housing issue, I think my expectation of why I thought it would be number one is because that's what is being talked about by the media more so. There's more information out on housing in the general populace than information on animal health, right? Overall, animal feed, how they're cared for. The more the industry can get those other stories out, the more it lifts, right, perceptions of the industry in being a good steward for animals. Lauren?
I forget which one of your slides had it, but it showed a very large percent that was very concerned, included Hispanic or Spanish background. Can you talk a little bit about why you think there was some concern about perceptions related to different multicultural audiences?
Yeah, and that popped particularly in the concerned influential. So they're thinking about it, they're worried about it as a problem, and they're talking to others. So we see that aspect that a higher level engagement in communities is driving that as well. So more conversations within their families and extended communities on pork. Certainly a product that they're part of cultural experiences, right? A very important product. And so there's more conversation happening there, particularly with that concerned public influential skewing more into diverse audiences. And I think that's a significant opportunity for the pork industry. It's a growing sector of the country and one that is consuming, has opportunity to consume more and more meat for their families.
How about from over there? It's pretty quiet.
So just a couple of observations. It gave, not that your study is not valid, but I saw a couple of things. The 19% have people think you have not done, or the industry has not done enough, and then 23% are active public influencers in, going after it. So it kind of validates both those things.
Extremes. Yep.
Yeah. A question, the meat reducers, 28%. My question was why? Was it cost, or what did cost have a factor in that, or was it the animal well-being? And
No, the number one reason for reduction in meat is actually a personal choice in health and nutrition. So
Okay.
that's number one. Number two and three, we're getting. 3 was more in price, 2 is more in the animal well-being concerns over, and not just pork, any animal,
Sure.
just not in their belief and value structure to consume meat. But number one is just a question on, or a belief that they're making a healthier choice by not consuming meat, a healthier choice for their body.
sure.
And more prevalent with younger generations. So that's one to watch over time to see how that changes as people age.
So maybe just a couple things. Perception, that's the younger gen. I think some of this, and I could be way off base, but I think some of this is through the education system. I really do. And the way to combat that, I think, is and I've been coming to these meetings. I grew up on a farm, hog farm, very close to here. I'm a banker right now, but I've been hearing the tell our story, tell our story, tell our story. You got to show. Telling is just one piece of it. You got to show. And with all the social media stuff, you can show it. And I know farmers are very averse to letting anybody come on their property for fear of fallout because of it. But honestly, you got to get beyond that, and you got to show it. You got to show how they're being treated. I mean, take people out there tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
See what the hogs are, the conditions they're going to be in tomorrow. They're going to be loving it, I remember, growing up, and we had sows outside, and I mean, in some of the cold days in the winter, they were stacked 2-3 deep, because it was so cold. And yeah, we bedded them and everything, but it was, man, they like it in the confinement buildings. I'm telling you, it's way better. But you got to show it. You got to show the people.
Yeah.
And probably get into the education system. So, public education.
Well, and that can have multiple benefits, right? So, some of your speakers earlier today talked about lack of workforce, right? Workforce challenges that you have. So the earlier our youth are learning not just about meat as a product to consume and the protein and the nutrients, and learning about agriculture as well can also bring out opportunities for hiring down the road and being a career of interest. So that focus on education has many, many benefits connected with it.
To go along with your question or the comments that people want to hear about healthy pigs, one of the technologies out there that's being developed is gene editing, where we can get rid of a PRRS virus vaccine that makes our pigs healthy. What's your thoughts on how consumers would handle that when they hear that word or modified or anything, but it also makes the pigs healthier? Just wondering what your thoughts are.
My thoughts would be we've got to find ways to communicate that in a manner that doesn't frighten consumers, because that's going to be a term that has a lot of negative connotations to it. So there might be other ways to say it and communicate and educate people. to make it more relatable so they can understand it and get over that fear factor.
Get my steps in today.
I'll keep asking them because I love Carol's work. So, right on this slide, you talk about how if they're familiar with some of the We Care programs, PQA, things like that. My question is, what about them brings validity when it would be a program or something that like they would have to research or like they don't know all the ins and outs of? Like, what is the basis for why that provides some amount of confidence? And like you said, if they're informed about them, they generally will feel better about whatever the question was.
It gives them a sense of accountability, and that's what they're looking for. So if they are aware of standards, then they don't have to get deep into the standards, but they know that you hold yourselves accountable. You hold yourselves accountable. That means a lot to people. We were just doing a lot of qualitative discussions in the state of Ohio, both with members of communities, rural communities, but also public officials, elected officials. And that comment on holding your own accountable. You have your standards, right? And you hold your own accountable. That gives me confidence. I don't need to hold you accountable. You're holding yourselves accountable. So having greater awareness and understanding that standards exist, practices exist, gives people that level of confidence to feel, okay, I can make a sound choice for myself and my family. I don't feel guilty about that choice, and I can feel comfortable in doing that. So that accountability is key.
Other questions? Maybe just one I had, Carol. So coming here, representing as a producer, and knowing there's some other producers in here as well, I think about the information you've shared, and, while I'm fairly well versed in understanding, aligning the information that has been given to us by the consumer directly and how to weave that into conversations, I'd say we come from organizations where we have team members who are going to vary to their comfort levels in having those conversations.
Absolutely.
So I guess question for you, maybe Caitlin, from a National Pork Board standpoint, I guess what are your recommendations, suggestions on how you kind of ensure that you provide the appropriate level of information like this to our teams, and how best to get them feeling comfortable with having those conversations?
Yep. And I think part of that is also the, I'll call it those easy talking points. So what's the crib sheet that comes out of here? So that as you're out in your community and you're talking to a neighbor or talking to a public official, you've got the crib sheet in your pocket that's over time, it's become second nature, that I know that I want to hit on these 2 or 3 key things when I'm talking with my neighbor, when I'm talking with my public official, when I'm talking with the economic development team in my area. So that, to me, is what makes these types of insights useful. So it's evidence-based. It helps you make more informed decisions, keeping the lens of, in this case, the consumer in mind, but then translating into FAQs and simple talking points for your staffs and people are great.
Yeah. In your opinion, if you had done the same survey on cattle, what would you have seen?
Yeah, so cattle, poultry, and pork. So the first half of the survey, in terms of concerns about meat, are consistent. Up until the point of perceptions on, so who does better on these things? That's where you see the delineation of false narratives being out there around pork. That's what's got to be corrected, right? And part of that is being address through Mythbusters, but people have the same concerns about animals, the care of animals being raised for food. Their concerns are consistent across cattle, poultry, pork. But when you ask how well is each industry doing on those things, pork is more harshly criticized than others. And that's due to some of the false narratives that are out there about pork.
You know, as if you went to a feed yard, cattle feed yard, after some rain, I mean, it sure don't compare to
Right.
a slatted hog farm.
Exactly, yeah. But the public doesn't understand that, and to your point, show them. Show, educate, build that awareness and understanding.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, so in this particular piece of work, the National Pork Board also worked with the National Pork Producers Council, is that the correct name? To identify states based on their view of risk on legislation. So either current or pending legislation to increase standards or mandates. Yep. And then with like the broader sustainability work, often the pork board will do the work at the national level, and then some states might opt in a next round to include their state as an additional lens. So I can't see if anybody's out here from Ohio, Indiana, Michigan. I know somebody was here from Indiana a little bit ago. But they're doing a lot like that in terms of, okay, well, how does the Midwest look as a region as it relates to these things? What's different about the Midwest? How might we have to approach things maybe together as a unified group? Or the Western states pulled together and did the same on sustainability. What can we pool things together and go after it? Not just as one state, but as 3 states together.
Maybe one more question for me, at least. And I'm not sure if this falls within this study or some of the work you've done, but out of curiosity, I mean, we deal with animal activism and kind of coupled with that now, I think you can couple both animal and environmentalists together, and they're extremely well funded. So that's in itself quite a feat for us as an industry to try to proactively, to the best of our ability, combat that and get ahead of that from a messaging and influence on consumer standpoint. So I guess my question from probably the Real Pork campaign, the Eric Stolenstreet, Luke Bryan work, have we seen or are tracking any direct impact we are having on kind of that negative messaging towards our industry?
Yeah, there is tracking. I'm not involved in it, but I've seen some of the tracking from the MPB in terms of the Mythbusters and progress against their initiatives. And we were talking about this morning, I characterize it as chipping away slowly, but that's a long haul. That's a long haul game, and the more you can also understand where to meet the consumer, like where are they? Where are they consuming their information so that you're targeting your information to them in the channels and the sources and such that they're leveraging, especially the younger generations, and getting those messages out on social media. That's key.
Yeah, I think that's really important, actually, that in my head, at least, the whole targeting standpoint. So I think with some of these campaigns, it's hard for us because we feel like, oh, it's influential, it's impactful if we see it. Like Amber literally sees it, or another producer here sees it. But actually, it's probably best when we don't see it, and those dollars and campaigns are being targeted to the audience that most needs it.
That's
so
right.
Thanks for that point.